The petition they served me at church was signed by noon. By the end of dinner, Wade had 90 days to leave my building. The strangest part of that Tuesday was how ordinary my hands felt as I set 6 places at the table, folding the paper napkins into plain triangles the way my mother had taught me in a kitchen 40 years gone, while the folder that would end my son-in-law's comfortable life sat in the sideboard drawer 11 inches from his elbow, and he never once thought to open it. I want to tell this the way it actually unfolded, because the shape of the thing matters as much as the ending, and I have learned in 22 years of emergency nursing that the order in which the truth arrives is often the whole of the mercy or the whole of the cruelty. So I will move between the day it all came due and the long, patient months that built toward it, and I will try to be honest about both, even the parts where I did not feel strong at all, only certain. Begin with the morning. It was a Tuesday in the second week of October, and I had been awake since 4:15 because the human body does not forget 3 decades of night shifts simply because you have cut back to 2 shifts a week. I stood in my kitchen on Delacroix Street in Ashford Landing, our little river town on the Ohio, and I watched the fog come off the water the way it does every autumn, gray and slow. And I drank my coffee out of the tall enamel camping cup I have used since my husband Peter and I hiked the Red River Gorge in 1989, the summer before our daughter Delia was born. That cup has a dent in the rim from a rock slide, and a hairline of rust I refuse to sand out. And I mention it now because it will matter later, and because it was the one familiar weight in my hand while I rehearsed, silently, the sentences I intended to say by nightfall. Wade came downstairs at 7 in his running clothes, cheerful in the particular way of a man who believes the universe is arranged in his favor. He was 34 then, my daughter's husband of 6 years, and he had lived under my roof for the last 14 months, ever since his commercial inspection business folded and they lost the house on Weller Court. He kissed the top of my head as he passed, which he had started doing about the time he decided I was declining, and he asked whether I had remembered to take my medication, and I told him I had, which was true, though the only medication I take is a low-dose thyroid pill I have taken since I was 38. He nodded, as if he had confirmed something about me, filled the water bottle, and went out to run 4 miles along the levee. I watched him go, and I felt no anger in that moment, only a clarity as cold and clean as the river fog, because I already knew what was folded in the sideboard drawer, and I knew who was coming to dinner. To understand why a woman would spend a year assembling the quiet unmaking of her own son-in-law, you have to go back to the 3rd Sunday in April, to Grace Covenant Church on Founders Avenue, where I have sat in the 4th pew from the front on the left side since 1996. It was Communion Sunday. I had just come back to my seat with the little cup and the bit of bread, and Pastor Reyes was reading the passage about the house built on the rock, when a young man in a gray suit I did not recognize came up the side aisle and stopped at the end of my pew. He was polite. He asked, quietly, whether I was Mara Calloway, and when I said that I was, he handed me a folded sheaf of legal papers, said, "You've been served," and walked back out the way he had come. And I sat there, with the taste of the wafer still on my tongue, holding a petition for the appointment of a guardian and conservator over my person and my estate, filed by my daughter, Delia Calloway Hutchins, on the grounds that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. I did not make a sound. I folded the papers once more, along the crease the young man had already made, and I slid them into my handbag beside my reading glasses. And I sang the closing hymn, which was, "It is well," because I was not going to give anyone in that sanctuary the satisfaction of watching me come apart over the body of Christ. But I will tell you the truth, because I promised myself I would. My ears rang the whole drive home, and I sat in my own driveway for 11 minutes before I could trust my legs to carry me inside. And that afternoon I lay down on the bed Peter and I had shared, and I stared at the ceiling fan, and I let myself understand that my only child had decided, with paperwork, that I was a problem to be administered. Delia had not done this alone. I knew that within a week. When my attorney, Whitney Osei, pulled the filing, the petition had been prepared not by the family lawyer we had used for years, but by a firm out of Cincinnati called Vantage Legal, whose entire specialty, Whitney explained, was elder guardianship, the industrial kind, the kind that files by the hundred. And the person who had first contacted Vantage, whose email address appeared on the intake form, was not my daughter. It was Wade. Let me tell you who I am, because the petition claimed I had forgotten, and the answer is the whole engine of what came after. I am Mara Calloway. I was born in 1979 in a coal-adjacent town 2 counties over, the youngest of 4, and I put myself through the nursing program at the community college by cleaning offices from 10 at night until 2 in the morning. I married Peter Calloway when I was 23. Peter was a plumber, then a plumbing contractor, and then, in a turn no one in our families understood at the time, a man who bought buildings. He bought them the way a plumber buys them, which is to say, he bought the ones nobody else wanted because he could see past the failed boiler and the water damage to the good bones underneath. And he bought them slowly, one at a time, over 25 years, refinancing one to fund the next, never borrowing more than he could cover if half of them sat empty. When Peter died of a heart attack in the produce aisle of the Kroger on Route 7 in the spring of 2019, at the age of 51, he left me the buildings, and he left me the ledgers, and he left me a note in his blocky handwriting that said, "You always understood these better than I did. Don't let anyone talk you out of what's yours." Here is the plain fact of it, the one I kept folded away for a year. I own most of Founders Avenue. Not the church and not the bank, but the storefronts, the 2-story brick buildings that make up the 4 blocks everyone in Ashford Landing means when they say downtown. 9 buildings, 17 commercial units, the offices above them. I am the majority landlord of the main street of my own town, and almost nobody knows it. Because the buildings are held through a company Peter named after nothing in particular, Sycamore Holdings, and because I have never once in my life wanted a soul to treat me differently for it. I kept working as a nurse after Peter died, because the ER is where I know who I am, and because standing over a frightened teenager with a broken femur at 2 in the morning is worth more to me than any rent roll. I let people think I was a widow of modest means who had kept her husband's little rental or 2. I let Wade think it most of all. Now go back to the erosion, because betrayal on this scale is never a single blow. It is a slow flooding, and you do not notice the water until it is at your knees. It started small, the way these things do, in the months after Wade and Delia moved in. Wade took an interest in my finances that he framed as helpfulness. He asked to streamline my bill paying, and when I said no, he began, without my permission, having my mail forwarded to a post office box he had opened, which I discovered only when my property tax notice for the Founders Avenue block did not arrive, and Whitney called to ask why. He told the pharmacist on Route 7 that I was confused about my prescriptions and asked them to route my questions through him, which is how the whole town first came to hear that Mara Calloway might be slipping. He rearranged the labels of my kitchen so the mugs and the plates were where a person with dementia might need them to be, and when I moved them back, he wrote it down, I later learned, as evidence of my agitation. The second scene I will give you is the dinner in June, because that was the night I understood he was not merely officious, but certain, the way a zealot is certain. His sister Jody was visiting from Louisville, and over my own pot roast at my own table, Wade explained to her, gesturing at me with his fork as though I were a case study, that he had taken on the responsibility of protecting Mara from herself, that I had assets I couldn't manage, and that it was, in his words, honestly a form of love that costs you something, stepping in before someone hurts themselves. Jody looked at me with the soft, terrible pity people reserve for the already gone. I said nothing. I had learned by then that arguing with Wade was like arguing with a man who has read the last page of a book he has not opened. He did not experience my words as information, only as symptoms. The third scene came in August, and it was the coldest. I overheard him on the back porch, on the phone with someone at Vantage Legal, and he was not whispering because it did not occur to him that I might understand what I was hearing. He said, "Once the conservatorship is in place, we consolidate the properties and sell the downtown parcels. There's a developer out of Columbus already interested in the founder's block. We're talking real money." And then he said the thing I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since, the thing that ended, in me, whatever was left of the hope that this was a misunderstanding. He said, "She'll be more comfortable somewhere managed, honestly. This is the kindest version of how this goes." That was when I stopped grieving and started building. Come back now to the Tuesday, because by 10 that morning I was placing the last pieces, and I want you to see how quiet the work of it actually is. At 9:30, I drove downtown and parked behind the old Delano building, the corner unit at Founders and 2nd, and I let myself in through the back stair to the second-floor office where Sycamore Holdings keeps its records in 3 gray filing cabinets that Peter bought at a county surplus auction in 2004. I took out the master deed folder for the residential property on Delacroix Street, my own house, the house Wade and Delia were living in, and I confirmed for myself with my own eyes what Whitney had already confirmed in writing, that the house was titled solely in the name of Sycamore Holdings, of which I am the sole member and manager, and that neither Delia's name nor Wade's name appeared on any instrument touching that property, not the deed, not the mortgage, because there was no mortgage, because Peter and I had burned it in the backyard in 2011. Wade had been living all these months in a building he did not own, could not sell, and had no legal standing over whatsoever, while he wrote to lawyers about consolidating my estate. I made 2 phone calls from that office. The first was to Whitney Osei to confirm she would be at dinner and would bring the second folder, the one that mattered even more, the certified copy of the court's order. Because the reckoning was not going to be my word against his. The second call was to Delia. That call was the hardest thing I did all year, harder than reading the petition, harder than what came at dinner, and I will come back to it, because loyalty tested is the true subject of this story, and my daughter was the test I could not bear to fail. While I am in the past, let me tell you about the cold decision and the preparation, so the ending does not seem like luck. The morning after I overheard the porch call in August, I did not confront Wade. I have learned that a wound you announce is a wound the other party has time to dress. Instead, I drove to Whitney Osei's office above the pharmacy on Founders, my building, though she pays a fair rent like everyone, and I have never once reminded her of it. And I laid the whole thing out. Whitney is 51, a Ghanaian-born attorney who came to Ashford Landing to marry a river barge engineer named Carl and stayed after Carl passed, and she is the only person outside a bank who has ever seen the full extent of what Peter left me. She did not gasp when I told her about the petition. She got out a legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and she asked me what outcome I actually wanted, which is the question that separates a good lawyer from a loud one. I told her I wanted 3 things. I wanted the guardianship petition dead, I wanted Wade out of my house, and I wanted my daughter back, if my daughter was reachable, which I did not yet know. Whitney handled the first thing with a thoroughness that would have frightened Wade if he had understood it. She arranged for me to be evaluated, my own idea, and I insisted on it, by Dr. Elaine Pruitt, a geriatric psychiatrist in Cincinnati who charges $400 for a comprehensive competency evaluation and is, more to the point, entirely unbuyable. I sat with Dr. Pruitt for 3 hours in September and answered every question, did every task, and she wrote a 19-page report concluding that I was fully competent, oriented, and, in one line I have framed in my mind ever since, notable for a degree of financial and administrative sophistication well above population norms. Whitney filed a motion to dismiss the guardianship petition with that report attached, along with an affidavit detailing the mail diversion and the pharmacy contact, which, it turns out, are not clever family management, but a pattern courts recognize and dislike intensely. The judge signed the dismissal on the second Monday in October. That was Monday. Dinner was Tuesday. I had asked Whitney to hold the certified order one day so that I could be the one to deliver the news at my table, in my house, in my own time. She thought it was theatrical. She was right. I did not care. Now the day again, the afternoon of it, the room filling. By 5 o'clock, the fog had burned off and the light through my kitchen window had gone gold and long, and I was browning the same pot roast in the same enameled Dutch oven, and I confess the ordinariness of it steadied me, the way a familiar procedure steadies you in a coding room. You do the next correct thing, and then the next, and the fear has nowhere to sit. Delia arrived first at 10 of 6, and I need to tell you about that because everything I did that year, I did for the chance of that 10 minutes. When I had called Delia that morning from the Sycamore office, I had not accused her. I had said simply that I loved her, that I knew Wade had drafted the petition, that I had proof I was competent, and that I needed her to come to dinner that night, whatever she decided about her marriage, because I was her mother, and there was a version of the evening she would not want to have missed. There was a long silence on the line, the kind you learn to wait through at a bedside, and then my daughter said, in a small voice I had not heard since she was 9 and had broken the neighbor's window, "Mama, I didn't want to sign it." And I said I knew, and she said, "He told me it was the only way to keep you safe. He had it all explained. There were charts." And I understood then that Wade had done to my daughter a gentler version of what he had tried to do to me. He had persuaded her, with the calm certainty of a true believer, that her own judgment could not be trusted against his. So when Delia came through my door at 10 of 6 that Tuesday, 31 years old and gray under the eyes, and stood on the mat not knowing whether she was still welcome, I did the only thing that mattered in the whole long year. I put down the wooden spoon, and I crossed the kitchen, and I held my daughter while she shook, and I told her that a person can be wrong and still be loved, that the two are not opposites, and that whatever happened at that table, she would leave it still mine. She was the conscience that came home. She was the one who, when I asked whether she would sit beside me or beside her husband, wiped her face with the heel of her hand and said, "Beside you, Mama," and pulled out the chair to my right. And I promise you, that small wooden scrape was the sweetest sound of the entire ordeal, sweeter by far than anything Wade's face would do an hour later. Whitney came at 6 with a leather portfolio and a bottle of Kentucky bourbon she set on the counter without comment. A woman who knew the evening might require it. Jody came at 10 past, having driven up from Louisville because Wade had told her, God help us, that tonight the family was going to get Mara the help she needed, and she brought a store cheesecake and the expression of a woman braced for a difficult intervention. And Wade came down last at 6:15, freshly showered, expansive, the host of a gathering he believed he had convened. He had, in fact, encouraged this dinner all week. He thought it was his night. We sat. I served the roast and the potatoes and the green beans I had put up myself last September, and for a while it was almost unbearably normal. The passing of dishes, Jody's careful small talk, and Wade holding forth about a developer and the future of the riverfront, not yet knowing he was describing my property to my face. I let him talk. I have sat with dying men who needed to finish their sentence, and I've learned to let a person arrive at the edge in their own time. Then, when the plates were mostly empty, Wade cleared his throat and folded his hands and shifted into the register I had come to know, the warm, grave, managerial tone, and he said, "Mara, we're all here because we love you, and Delia and I have been talking, and there are some decisions coming up about the properties and your care that we think it's time to make as a family, with the right support in place. He glanced at Whitney, whom he had been told was a friend of mine, and added generously, "It's good to have counsel here." I set down my fork. I did not raise my voice. I have watched enough people receive the worst news of their lives to know that volume is the resort of the uncertain, and I was not uncertain about a single thing. I said, "Wade, before we make any decisions as a family, I'd like to correct the record on a few facts, because I think you've been working from bad information." I opened the sideboard drawer at my left hand, and I took out the first folder, and I laid Dr. Pruitt's report on the table, turned so he could read the letterhead. This is a competency evaluation done last month by a geriatric psychiatrist you didn't choose and can't call. It concludes I am fully competent. I paid $400 for the privilege of proving something I shouldn't have had to prove to my own son-in-law. The warmth held on his face for a moment, the way heat lingers in a room after the furnace cuts off. He said evenly, "Mara, one doctor's opinion doesn't change the pattern we've all seen." "Whitney," I said, "would you hand Wade the order?" Whitney slid a single certified page across the table, and Jody, who had understood before her brother did, put her hand over her mouth. Wade read it twice. It was the court's dismissal of the guardianship petition, with the finding in the flat language of law that the petition had been filed on an insufficient basis, and that the evidence indicated interference with the respondent's mail and medical care. His name was in it. Not as a petitioner of record, he had been too careful for that. He had put Delia's name on the front. But in Whitney's affidavit, quoted, the intake email to Vantage Legal, the porch call I had written down within the hour, dated and specific. He did not go pale, and he did not beg. And I want to be truthful about that, because it is the part people find hardest to believe. Wade grew calmer. A true believer does not experience defeat as defeat. He experiences it as a test of faith. He set the order down, and he looked at me with something close to sorrow, and he said, "You've clearly had help putting this together," which honestly proves my point. You're being manipulated, Mara. Someone's gotten to you. And he actually turned to Delia and said, "Sweetheart, this is exactly the confusion I've been trying to protect her from." And Delia, my daughter, my quiet daughter, who had spent 6 years being persuaded out of her own eyes, said, "No, Wade, she's the clearest person at this table. She always was. I let you tell me otherwise." That was the moment, if there was one, and it did not belong to me. It belonged to her. I let the silence do its work, and then I reached into the drawer one last time and took out the second folder, the thicker one, and I opened it in front of him the way I have opened a chart to explain to a family what they are truly facing. "Wade," I said, "you've spent months planning to consolidate and sell the Founders Avenue properties. I want to make sure you understand what those are, in plain terms, because I don't think anyone ever told you." I turned the first deed toward him. 9 buildings on Founders Avenue and the corner of 2nd are owned by Sycamore Holdings. Peter and I bought them over 25 years. Whitney rents her office in one. The pharmacy that fills your prescriptions is my tenant. So is the coffee shop where you meet your developer friend. I watched him find the ownership line, the sole member line, the name that was mine and only mine. I am the majority landlord of downtown Ashford Landing. I have been the entire time you've lived in my house, talking about my little rental property. Jody made a sound. Wade said nothing now. I turned the last document toward him, the one Whitney had prepared and I had signed that afternoon at the Sycamore office. "And this," I said, "is the deed to the house you're sitting in. It's titled to Sycamore Holdings. There's no mortgage. We paid it off in 2011. Your name isn't on it. Delia's name isn't on it. You have no ownership, no equity, and no standing here of any kind." I set beside it a single sheet with a specific date at the top. "This is a formal notice to vacate. You have 90 days until the 14th of January to leave this property. Delia is welcome to stay as long as she likes. That is her choice to make and not yours, and it always was." Here is where the flavor of the thing is particular, and I will not pretend it was a clean, bright triumph, because it was not, and the honest telling matters more to me than the tidy one. Wade did not crumble, and he did not repent. He sat very still, and then he gathered the papers into a neat stack and squared their edges, a man restoring order to a world that had betrayed him. And he said, quietly, "You've made a serious mistake here, Mara. All of you have. When this falls apart, and it will, I hope you'll remember I was the only one trying to look after the long term." He stood and he thanked me for dinner, which was either the last reflex of a well-raised man or the final proof that he still believed himself the reasonable one at the table. And he went upstairs, and we heard the guest room door close with no slam in it at all, which was somehow worse than a slam. That is how the wind tasted. Not like a door slammed, but like a seed set in cold ground. The reckoning was real, and it was recorded, and it would harvest itself over the coming months in the plain arithmetic of a man with 90 days and no house. But it did not give me the satisfaction of watching him break, because he would not break where I could see it, and I have made my peace with that. Some people never hand you the apology. They only hand you the exit, and you learn to accept the exit as its own kind of answer. Now the aftermath, and my people, because that is where the meaning of the year finally settled. Wade left on the 4th of January, 10 days early, for a rental in Loveland, closer to a job I hear he took with a property management outfit, which has its own bleak comedy. He and Delia are not divorced. They are, in her word, figuring it out. And I have learned to keep my mouth shut and my door open, which is the hardest nursing I have ever done. Delia moved into the front bedroom that was hers as a girl. She started seeing a counselor named Priya in Cincinnati on Thursdays, and about a month in, she told me the thing I keep folded now, where I used to keep my dread, that she had begun to trust her own mind again, and that she was sorry, and that she had signed that petition on the worst advice of her life. And I told her the same thing I told her on the mat by the door, that being wrong and being loved are not opposites. Whitney and I split that bottle of bourbon over cards 2 Fridays later, and she told me the affidavit had been the cleanest work she'd done in a decade. And I told her the rent on her office was frozen for as long as she practices. And she said, absolutely not. And we left it unresolved, the way old friends leave the things that matter. As for the enamel cup with the dent in the rim and the rust I won't sand out, I still drink my coffee from it at 4:15 when the river fog comes up. And one gray morning in February, Delia came down early and asked if she could have one just like it. And I told her Peter and I had bought them at an outfitter in Slade, Kentucky in the summer of 1989, and that mine was not for sale, but that I would drive her down to find her own. And we did, in April, on a Saturday, the two of us, and she picked a green one and dented it herself on purpose against a boulder above the Red River, laughing. And that dent is the truest thing I own now, truer than any deed. I will tell you one plain thing before I go, and I mean it for you and not for the story. When someone spends a year telling the world you cannot be trusted with your own life, do not spend that year shouting that you can. Keep the ledgers. Keep the friends who knew you before you had anything, and let the paper speak at the hour you choose. The people who stay will be the ones worth setting a place for, and you will know them, in the end, by who pulls their chair to your side of the table.